10 loving fathers who snapped and slaughtered their families. Welcome to Creepshow, the channel where we delve into the darkest corners of the human psyche and uncover the chilling stories that keep you up at night. Today, we explore the horrifying tales of fathers who went from loving protectors to cold-blooded killers in an instant. These are the men who snapped, turning their strength against the very families they were supposed to cherish. Brace yourselves as we uncover 10 loving fathers who snapped and slaughtered their families. Viewer discretion is advised. Number 10. William Parente, the Fallen Financier. When William Parente was 30 years old, he may have had the dream that he would be recognized as a prominent real estate attorney in New York. At the age of 40, he might have earned a reputation for being a family man who puts in a lot of effort. When he was 58 years old, it appeared that he would be most accurately remembered as the person who was responsible for a high-stakes Ponzi scheme. On the other hand, when he passed away at the age of 59, he would achieve a completely different kind of infamy. Although Parente had a successful career in law and high finance, it appeared that he was still deeply rooted in topics pertaining to his family. He supported his wife and daughters in a satisfactory manner. According to reports, he delighted in taking them back to the neighborhood where he had spent his childhood, where he could indulge in the regional food, maintain relationships with old friends, and go trick-or-treating on Halloween. Regrettably, Parente began to engage in reckless behavior with regard to financial matters toward the end of his career. It was he who discovered high-risk projects that were looking for startup loans and funded them with cash from investments made by other clients. 2009 was the year that the web began to unravel around him. His checks totaling $245,000 had been returned unpaid, prompting the Federal Bureau of Investigation to launch an investigation into charges that he had scammed investors of $20 million. In April, Parente brought his wife and younger daughter on a trip to Maryland, ostensibly to visit his older daughter, who was attending Loyola University. However, the family was murdered while they were there. On the other hand, once he arrived, he started systematically eliminating the women whom he had spent his entire life providing for. When Parente arrived to the Sheraton Hotel in Towson, he took Catherine, who was 11 years old at the time, out of the room for a short period of time so that he could be alone with his wife. Upon Catherine's return, she discovered that her mother, Betty Parente, who was 58 years old, had been suffocated to death. Soon after, she joined her mother on the bed of the motel as a body that had been suffocated. The last thing that Parente did was phone his daughter Stephanie, who is 19 years old, and urge her to come to the hotel. Stephanie paid attention to her father's call despite the fact that she was caught off guard. It was midnight, and she had not yet returned. When a concerned roommate called, the only person who answered the phone was a peculiar-sounding Parente, who informed her that Stephanie was sleeping over. His destiny was that the hotel personnel, who had been suspicious of the situation, finally broke into the room a day later and discovered all 4 of the Parente dead. After he had taken the life of his oldest child, William had taken his own life at some point in the early hours of the morning. By paying the ultimate price and compelling his family to pay it as well, Parente was able to escape the financial difficulties and legal troubles that were chasing him. However, this was only possible because he paid the ultimate price. The extended family made certain that William was laid to rest in a funeral service that was distinct from the one that was held for his victims. Number 9. Simon Peter Nelson, the Daddy Issues Killer. Previously featured on the documentary titled 10 Men Who Killed Their Families, Simon Peter Nelson Jr., a resident of Illinois, embarked on a path that led to his own negative consequences from a young age. An abusive father, identified as Simon Peter Nelson Sr., ruined the son's boyhood and then took his own life when Jr. was still a child. As a result, the son was unable to have any kind of resolution to the trauma that he had experienced. After falling into sadness and having his own thoughts of suicide as he grew up, Nelson Jr. eventually came to the conclusion that his entire existence was dependent on whether or not a woman desired him. In 1961, when his first wife filed for divorce from him, he made a threat to take his own life, but she ended up leaving him instead. His chronic self-doubt continued to plague him even after he successfully remarried and became a father to 6 children with his second wife, Anne. Due to the fact that he was never able to maintain a consistent work, his wife was responsible for the most of the financial support. In addition to his drunkenness, his lack of desire caused him to ignore his children, and as a result, they frequently arrived at school soiled and dressed in clothes that were worn out. During the several arguments that he had with Anne, he frequently threatened to take his own life in an effort to garner her sympathy. He appeared to be driven insane by the idea that she was considering getting a divorce after all. Something broke in Nelson when she communicated that she was going to go through with the divorce by moving out of the house and staying in a hotel. For the purpose of protecting herself, Anne had moved away, leaving her 6 children alone with their father. This led to the murder of the family. This turned out to be a horrible error. During the early hours of January 7, 1978, Nelson became violent and committed homicide. This occurred after he had ended an unsuccessful final phone contact with Anne. Their skulls were crushed with a mallet, and their bodies were stabbed multiple times. Jenny, who was 12 years old, and Roseanne, who was 6 years old, both died together in the bed that they shared in the girls' room. The family dog passed away in the middle of them, with its throat cut. David, who was 3 years old, Matthew, who was 7 years old, Andrew, who was 8 years old, and Simon, who was 10 years old, were all victims of the assault with the mallet and the knife in the boys' room. Every single one of them was murdered while they were sleeping. Later, Nelson testified that he felt his own deceased father was the one who was responsible for the murders, and that he was the one who was murdering his way through the house. He also imagined that he was one of the victims. It is likely that this horrifying nightmare reached its pinnacle when his son, Simon Peter Nelson III, who was also his namesake, was being beaten with a mallet. Nelson drove to the hotel where his wife was staying and gained access to her room after he had finished the heinous act at the hotel. He spoke to her in a spooky manner, saying, "Call a priest, call 2 priests. After that, you should notify the authorities because I have murdered the children, and I have done it in such a spectacular manner that you will never have to work again. They are all dead. What are your feelings?" After throwing his glasses to the ground and yelling, "Daddy!" he continued to yell. After that, Nelson started beating her. It was still being shouted by him when the cops took him into custody. In court, Nelson asserted that he had attempted to commit insanity, and by doing so, he may have been able to avoid the death penalty. Nonetheless, this was the extent of the jury's mercy throughout the proceedings. He was given a sentence of 200 years in jail. It was on June 18, 2017, that he passed away in prison, having been denied parole no less than 19 times on several occasions. Number 8. Christian Longo. Family as an impediment to vacation. The father. Christian Longo desired the more luxurious aspects of life, such as vacations in other countries, luxurious automobiles, and high-quality wine, among other things. He was not all that dissimilar to a great many of other people in this regard. One of the most important distinctions was that he was willing to kill other people in order to obtain the more desirable items, and not just any other people. During his late 20s, Longo had already demonstrated that he was unsuccessful in a variety of ways. In addition to the fact that his commercial endeavors had failed, his work for other people had resulted in terminations, and he was on the run from con victims and creditors on multiple occasions. It was a long and exhausting journey for him to take his young family from Michigan to Ohio to Oregon, and they remained with him without question. Unfortunately for him, he did not regard them as a support system that would keep him safe. Rather, he saw them as anchors that would weigh him down. The first victims of Longo's homicide were his wife Mary Jane, who was 34 years old, and his youngest daughter Madison, who was 2 years old. After he had taken both of their lives by strangulation, he placed their bodies inside of a huge suitcase and then threw it into the water off the coast of Oregon. Shortly after that, he took the other children, Zachary, who was 4 years old, and Sadie, who was 3 years old, on a gruesome journey up the coast road. The fact that they inquired about Mommy's whereabouts on that last drive is unknown to us. It is unknown to us whether or not they inquired about the reason why rocks were attached to their feet. If they inquired as to the reason for their father's decision to halt the car in the middle of a bridge, we do not know. Even now, we are unable to determine which of them he knocked over the cliff first. As far as we are aware, he traveled home by himself. Several days before Christmas, the bodies started washing up on the coast of Oregon. His fate was determined by this. There was an immediate suspicion that Longo had gone missing. Nonetheless, it took the authorities a little while to locate him. In the year 2002, after putting him on the FBI's list of the 10 most wanted, they achieved their goal. Longo had finished packing his final baggage and had left for Mexico, where he planned to live the high life. In that location, at a beach resort in Cancun, the police discovered him. He was finally able to let his inhibitions go, and he had already found himself a new partner, a German tourist. He had also smoked marijuana, snorkeled, and smoked wine, and dined himself. After being extradited back to Oregon, Longo was quickly found guilty and put to death for his crime. To this day, he is still on death row, living a life that is polar opposite of what he had envisioned for himself. Since that time, he has been occupied with the process of developing unsuccessful ideas for an organ donation scheme for on-death row offenders. There is still the question of whether or not any transplant recipient would be interested in receiving a heart as dark as his. Number 7. Stephen Sueppel. Adoptive murder. Adoption is a life-changing event for thousands of children, as it ensures them that they will get love from their parents and that they will have a better future. In a tragic turn of events, the adoption of 4 children from Iowa by a deranged thief was a disastrous occurrence that ended their lives. An Easter Sunday Mass was attended by Stephen Sueppel and his wife, Cheryl, along with their 4 adopted children in the year 2008. Grandparents and friends did not observe anything out of the ordinary regarding their behavior. In the face of his imminent prosecution for embezzlement and money laundering, Stephen remained silent. He had not disclosed this information to anybody. Only like William Parente, Stephen wanted to avoid the shame of legal humiliation for himself and his family. The trial was scheduled to start in only a few weeks, but Stephen took the same approach as William Parente. And just like Parente, his solution was that it is impossible to humiliate individuals who have passed away. During that evening, Sueppel began his preemptive campaign by murdering his wife by hitting her with a baseball bat. This was known as the crime of the family. It was at that moment that the sickly incompetence of the former banker started to become apparent. In a message that was later discovered by the authorities, he expressed his regret that he had attempted to drown himself in the Iowa River, but he kept floating back up to the top of the river. As the clock struck midnight, he escorted the children into the family minivan, where he attempted to kill himself as well as the children by poisoning them with carbon monoxide. That, too, was a failure. With his patience waning, he brought his children back inside and returned to the method he had used earlier, which was the baseball bat. Ethan, who was 10 years old, Seth, who was 9 years old, and Mira, who was 5 years old, all passed away in their bedrooms as a result of severe blunt force injuries to their skulls and torsos. Eleanor, who was 3 years old at the time, had taken sanctuary in the playroom. Sueppel finished her off by using a new bat, while she was surrounded by her toys. His destiny. Before making a phone call to the authorities from his mobile phone, Sueppel spent a few hours recording confession letters and voicemails during his free time. He merely requested that they go to the residence of the family and then hung up. After waiting for 15 minutes, he was ultimately successful in taking his own life. At a high rate of speed, his vehicle collided with the abutment of a bridge, and he perished as a result of either the impact or the subsequent fire that ensued. At the funeral service for the Sueppel family, which took place in the same church where they had spent Easter the previous week, all 6 members of the family were honored together. An uproar ensued among the Catholic population of the city, as many individuals were opposed to the idea of holding a united burial mass for a murderer of this nature. Even yet, the mass was held as planned. The act of bringing a kid into the world and becoming a father carries with it an implicit and automatic obligation to safeguard that child. For this reason, we have a moral obligation to hate the behavior of a parent who kills his biological children. Before he deliberately and explicitly claimed responsibility for these 4 children, however, Stephen Sueppel did not have any obligations toward them. It is impossible for us to know the reason behind his blatantly violent betrayal of his commitment. All we can say is that it is an especially terrible sort of betrayal. Number 6. John Sharp, the Morningside Monster. When they are in a fit of wrath or insane, some people who kill their families suddenly become aware of their nefarious intentions. For other people, the animosity tends to build up gradually over a considerable amount of time. John Sharp, who lived in the neighborhood of Morningside in Australia, was one of the latter individuals. Over the course of his life, he meticulously built a resentment of his dependent loved ones, which eventually developed into a vicious murder. In 1994, Sharp tied the knot with Anna Kemp, and 8 years later, they welcomed their daughter Gracie into the world. Given that the young girl was born with hip dysplasia, it was necessary for her to wear a corrective harness while she was an infant. The agony made it impossible for her to eat or sleep well, and the burden of caring for her took its toll on the new parents. The pain made sleeping and eating difficult for her. Anna decided to take counseling. John did nothing except stew in his rapidly building rage. In the latter part of 2003, Anna became pregnant once more, much to John's amazement. When John was confronted with this, he decided to take up a rather strange activity because he believed that having one child was already a burden. In order to improve his aim, he began practicing with a spear gun. After a fight, Anna Kemp went to bed in a state of anger in March of 2004, which was a mistake that ultimately led to the death of her family. She would never be able to fully awaken from that sleep. While she was sleeping, John loaded the spear gun, pointed it at her temple, and discharged it from a distance that was completely unassailable. And then he did it once more. Anna and her unborn child, a boy they had previously named Francis, were both murdered by the second shot during the attack. Sharp took the spears from his wife's skull and buried her in a shallow grave in the backyard after he had dropped off his daughter at the Early Childhood Education Center. During the subsequent 4 days, he was alone himself, taking care of his daughter while also working up the courage to kill her. Over the course of the interim, he accompanied her on a trip to the store to buy another spear. Following the putting of Gracie to bed on March 27th, he numbed himself with a number of rum and coke beverages. A fresh supply of ammunition was delivered to the spear gun. He shot it toward her face, and the 2-year-old girl woke up screaming. He had aimed it at her face. One more time, the initial shot had not been successful in killing his victim. Sharp retrieved the 2 spears that were used in the death of his wife, and used them to shoot Gracie in the head and kill her as well. Despite everything, the youngster was still alive. After Sharp had exhausted all of her ammunition, she ripped one spear out of her skull so that she could fire it once more. After the fourth shot, she was killed. The body of Gracie was wrapped in trash bags and taped up before her father abandoned her at the nearby dump. Following the excavation and dismemberment of his wife, he proceeded to do the same thing to her. It had been a week that was nothing short of extraordinary. His destiny. John Sharp's extraordinary harshness was quickly followed by his astounding dishonesty for the first time. Through his impersonation of Anna, he sent forged messages and presents to members of the family. Sharp provided the information to the authorities that Anna had fled with another man, taking Gracie with her, after the disappearances were reported by family who were suspicious of her. He went so far as to make appearances in a number of national television interviews, pretending to be ignorant while pleading for Anna to return home. Even worse, he had the audacity to ask the general public for assistance in locating her. The deception continued until June, when he eventually admitted his guilt to the authorities when they were questioning him. As a result of his comments, law enforcement investigators searched the dump for a period of 3 weeks, during which time they were able to locate both bodies. At this time, they are interred together, with Anna's maiden name being used. Sharp, on the other hand, entered a guilty plea and was then sentenced to 2 life sentences. Even though he is currently being held in protective custody, he is nonetheless detained because other inmates have threatened his life. 2037 is the year that he will be eligible for parole. Number 5. Mesac Demas, a demoniac dad. The father. Mesac Demas, when he was a little boy, lived in Haiti during the 1970s and 1980s, and his life was fraught with instability and difficulties. His parents brought him up as an evangelical Christian till they left him behind to move to the United States of America. Even his moral formation was not uniform. His upbringing was taken over by relatives who practiced Haitian voodoo at that point in time. The only thing that appeared to be consistent throughout his life was an emphasis on the power that bad spirits had to impact the earth. It was inevitable that he would carry out the actions that he said they were encouraging him to do. Demas made his home in Florida, where he eventually tied the knot with Gerline Dieu, after he had himself immigrated to the United States at the age of 19. They had 5 children in a short amount of time. On the other hand, their domestic life was anything from a happy one. In January of 2009, Demas entered a plea of no contest to a charge of battery, despite the fact that he had a history of domestic violence with his wife. In September of that year, Gerline expressed to him that she was contemplating a divorce, which ultimately pushed him over the brink. The murder of the family. Demas did not waste much time. Exactly 24 hours after the subject of divorce was brought up, Demas ambushed his wife as she was returning home from work, bound her with rope and duct tape, and then brutally beat her to death. Then Demas turned his back on his children, and it appears that he blamed his wife for the crimes that he was going to perform. As their father pursued them, Mesac, who was 9 years old, Marvin, who was 6 years old, Maven, who was 5 years old, Megan, who was 3 years old, and Morgan, who was 11 months old, escaped via the family townhouse. A slashed throat or a snapped neck was the cause of death for each individual. Demas escaped to Haiti, despite the fact that he disapproved of suicide because it might keep him out of heaven. He did not take into account if his killings would have the same effect. The authorities quickly located Demas in Port-au-Prince, which was the end of his story. His guilt was never in question as far as Demas was concerned. He admitted to anyone who would listen that he was the one who did the atrocities, despite the fact that he had a list of people who he said were responsible for driving him to commit the crimes itself. If she had the audacity to even consider leaving him, his wife, for allegedly placing a voodoo curse on him, his mother-in-law is being held accountable. Evil spirits, which were evoked by the hex, and served as the impetus for his lethal spree. Despite the shifting of blame, Demas stated that he desired death within a short period of time, to get him back together with his family as soon as possible. By presenting evidence of a mental illness, Demas became the focal point of a volatile judicial circus that lasted for 8 years. His ability to stand trial was called into question by a number of alternative diagnoses. The procedures were made more difficult by his erratic and disruptive behavior in court. In spite of this, Demas and the Florida Circuit Court reached a consensus in October 2017 regarding the appropriate form of justice for his case, which was a sentence of death. In point of fact, there are 6 of them. Number 4. Abel Clemmons, the Axeman of Clarksburg. Similarly to Simon Nelson, we have already highlighted Abel Clemmons. Yet, a list such as this one would be incomplete if it did not include him. Despite the fact that the majority of the cases that are being discussed here are relatively recent, it is clear that the phenomena of dads betraying their families is not something that is unique to the modern period. A notable example is Abel Clemmons, who was one of the first people to settle in what is now known as West Virginia. A toxic combination of paternal absence, mental instability, and economic hardship appears to be the root cause of Clemmons' criminal behavior, as it appears to be the case with other men. Clemmons began his life in a wild and disorderly manner, devoting himself to prostitution, drunkenness, and other forms of debauchery, beginning at the age of 15. While Clemmons was still a child, his father had taken his own life, and his mother had made a futile effort to steer her son in the right direction. It is said that within a span of 2 years, he became engaged to 7 different women in the neighborhood, and he was forced to depart in order to avoid being prosecuted for a variety of serious offenses. Eventually, out of fear of the wrath of God, he made amends with himself and wed a woman named Barbara Carpenter, who was from Clarksburg. His life story already had a spectacular fall and redemption that would be amazing in someone twice that age. He was 19 years old at the time. It should not come as a surprise that his turbulent behavior will persist. Clemmons would go on to father 9 children with Barbara over the course of the subsequent 11 years. Clemmons' family had sprung onto the scene with feverish speed, just like with the rest of his life, and they would be snuffed out again in a manner that was quite similar to how they had appeared. Convinced that God had cursed him for being hesitant to leave Virginia for Ohio, and burdened with the fear that he would be unable to provide for his family, Clemmons sank deeper into the grasp of insanity. This eventually led to the death of his family. He deliberated over the act with a dreadful sense of uncertainty, but he was adamant about killing his family in order to spare them from the possibility of disaster. He urged himself to take action the half-dozen times that he stood over them while they were sleeping with an axe in his hand. A half-dozen times he pledged that he would not carry out his intention to murder, but the manic compulsions continued to persist. His wife awoke several times and asked him what he was doing awake. In each instance, he responded by saying that he was only admiring her beauties while sleeping. In the end, he decided to go ahead and do it in November of 1805. During the night, he arose, positioned himself over each member of the family in turn, and then struck them with a powerful blow from the axe, therefore causing their instantaneous death. Given the viciously unexpected nature of each attack, it was necessary for him to carry out each murder in the cabin with a single room so that he would not wake the other people. Under the awful weapon, Elijah, Hester, Rachel, Mary, Benjamin, and Amos all passed away in a quiet and methodical manner. Second, Barbara and her unborn child, who was only 1 month away from being born, were murdered. They were the last to arrive, including Clemmons' 2 daughters who were still alive. Clemmons' aim was less certain with them, and they awoke before they passed away. His words were as follows: "They all died easy, with the exception of my two little girls, Betsy and Parthenia, the struggles of whom added to the already indescribable horrors and tortures of my mind. Unbelievably, Clemmons' niece was also present at the cabin where they were staying that night. While Clemmons skillfully arranged the bodies and lectured her on the responsibility of a child to obey her parents, she huddled in the midst of the carnage, unable to find the words to express herself. At the very least, he did not cause her any physical harm when he left her. He was unable to force himself to kill himself, so Clemmons ran away to the surrounding rocky cliffs. He had the intention of killing himself, but he wanted to do it. As he eventually made his way to his mother's house, he was starving and delirious. He had been traveling around for days, trying to avoid being found by local search parties. The arrest of his extended relatives was orchestrated by someone else. The methods of historical justice were much different from what they are today, despite the fact that the parental barbarism of such characters can still be found in our own time. Clemmons' end came quickly, in contrast to the endings of the other survivors described in this article, who had been held in judicial limbo or on execution row for decades. Within a few weeks following the murders, he was found guilty, given the opportunity to testify while he was incarcerated, which is where the statements from above came from, and then executed by hanging in the early months of 1806. In the eastern part of Clarksburg, the cabin that belonged to Clemmons is no longer standing. Even so, the region continues to be considered one of the most rumored haunted places in the entire state of West Virginia. Number 3. Mark Barton, sparking a rampage. The father. It appears to be a pattern that is all too frequent, that which some men are motivated to commit murder by the possibility of experiencing financial difficulties. Furthermore, it is not a coincidence that the distress they fear was frequently brought on by their own faults in the first place for them to experience. The act of killing oneself is the limit for some men, while others kill their family, but no one else. On the other hand, there are individuals, such as Mark Barton, who, in order to release their rage at the world, resort to the act of familicide. At the time of his marriage to Leanne Van Driver in 1995, Barton already had a history that was fraught with much controversy. Both his mental illness, which was characterized by paranoia and delusions, and his minor criminal behavior at work, which resulted in his serving time in jail, contributed to his situation. With regard to the wedding, there was the fact that it was the result of an affair that had begun during his first marriage. This is not to mention the fact that his first marriage ended in the unsolved murders of his wife Deborah and her mother, who were both victims of a mysterious beating. Simply put, the fact that he was able to use the $300,000 in insurance money that he received as a result of Deborah's passing to speculate on the stock market was the cherry on top. Despite this, Barton's market performance was terrible, and he suffered a loss of more than $100,000 in June of 1999. Following the losses, his day trading firm decided to close his account. The impetus for this was this. In order to ensure that he would be able to wake up his wife while she was still sleeping on July 27, Barton programmed his alarm to go off early. In their bed, he killed her by bludgeoning her to death. He then proceeded to spend the subsequent 36 hours acting as if nothing had happened. It was not until the evening of July 28th that he betrayed his children, Matthew, who was 11 years old, and Michelle, who was 8 years old. They had made it through his first marriage, and they made it through his second marriage by a little day. Posting letters on the corpses of his family members as they were lying in bed, he did so. In the letters, he admitted to his wrongdoings while simultaneously expressing his affection for his family and blaming them for his collapse. Following that, he then spent the night in the company of the dead bodies. He was not finished. Upon waking up the following morning, he loaded 2 pistols and made his way to the offices of 2 day trading firms, both of which had previously employed him. There were 13 people injured and 9 additional people who had died by the time the smoke cleared around them. His destiny. Barton attempted to flee, but his escape did not endure for very long. He attempted to kidnap a little girl, possibly with the intention of holding her as a hostage, but she managed to get away and then alerted the authorities. Officers who were responding moved closer. They had cornered Barton at a petrol station after they had pursued his minivan for some time. Within that location, he committed suicide as a final act of cowardice. Number 2. Ernst August Wagner, a bestial man. From the time he was a child, Ernst Wagner, who was born in 1874, did not have a single model of how to establish a healthy home life. The drunken father of Wagner, who was only 2 years old at the time, passed away, leaving the impoverished family without a source of income. The frequent infidelity of his mother led to the dissolution of her second marriage, which occurred barely 5 years after the first. One possible explanation for the fact that 9 of the boy's 12 siblings passed away before reaching adulthood is that they did not receive adequate care from their parents. From an early age, Wagner developed a resolute attitude toward death. During his formative years, he developed into a troubled educator. Wagner did not disqualify himself as a potential romantic partner, despite the fact that he suffered from melancholy, attempted suicide, bestiality, and paranoia around the possibility of neighboring villagers discovering said bestiality. Despite his busy schedule, he managed to seduce the daughter of an innkeeper, enter into a shotgun marriage after he had already impregnated her, and father several additional children. However, it appeared that there was no possibility of parenthood removing the demons that resided within him. According to reports, he did not feel any emotion for his wife and children, and his primary opinion was that he was resentful of the expense that they represented. The feeling that he was being despised by other people continued to grow until 1912, when he made the decision to devise a ruthless plan of retribution. Wagner was going to make sure that he had no more mouths to feed, and the villagers were going to suffer for their supposed hatred in the near future. The familicide. Wagner's vengeance binge began after he had meticulously planned it out for more than a year. It started in the house. While his wife and children were sleeping, he proceeded to bludgeon each of them in order to eliminate any possibility of resistance. He proceeded to stabbing them repeatedly, till they died from major hemorrhages, after which he put a knife to their throats and chests. Clara Wagner, age 10, Elsa, age 8, Robert, age 6, and Richard, age 5, were all found dead inside the house. Despite the fact that he was changing out of his blood-soaked nightshirt, Wagner continued to turn his attention forward. He was just on the verge of beginning. His wife's hometown of Mühlhausen, as well as the place where he had initially experienced what he believed to be judging eyes, would now be the target of the majority of his rage. Wagner started his tirade when he arrived, which was close to midnight, and it was raining heavily. Using the fire to entice individuals to come out of their hiding places, he lit fires in 4 different barns. Through the use of a couple of pistols, he was able to eliminate the villagers who had come out to investigate the situation. His face was concealed by a black veil that he had taken from his wife, and he engaged in combat with the terrified and outraged citizens of the town, ultimately causing the deaths of 9 and hurting 11 more. When Wagner failed to remember to reload his weapon, a throng of villagers surrounded him with hoes and swords. This was the only thing that brought an end to the nightmare. They assaulted him, mutilated him, and then abandoned him in the gutter after they had finished. Still, he was not dead, according to his fate. It was later discovered by a law enforcement officer that he was still alive, and he was brought to a hospital. It was determined that the severity of his injuries required the amputation of his left forearm. It was during the procedure that he admitted to killing members of the family. At some point in the future, he would be judged not guilty by reason of insanity, which would be the first verdict of its kind in the region, and he would be sent to an asylum. Wagner continued to reside there for another quarter of a century, during which time he led a peaceful life as an amateur dramatist. In 1938, he passed away ultimately due to tuberculosis. The fact that he passed away in bed, receiving excellent treatment right up until the very end, was a source of unending resentment for the relatives of those who were killed by him. It was a system that was more merciful than he was, and he benefited from it. Number 1. Ramon Salcido, a bittersweet conclusion. The father. Ramon Salcido, a Mexican immigrant to California, did not have anger that was motivated by economic desperation, in contrast to many of the other people described here. As a matter of fact, his anger was a reaction to the fact that his wife had been unfaithful. Regrettably, his exaggerated reaction resulted in the loss of many more lives, including those of children who, as a matter of course, had no say in the matter of who their parents were. Angela Salcido, Salcido's wife, revealed to him in April 1989 that their eldest daughter, Sophia, had most certainly been fathered by a different man prior to the Salcido's marriage. Additionally, she informed him that she was contemplating a divorce, and she soon departed from the family home. For the same reason as Simon Nelson's wife did, it appears that she did not have any concerns about leaving the children alone with their father. At the end of the day, she was the one he was upset with. Angela had not only abandoned Ramon with the children, but she had also abandoned him alone with his drugs and booze. This occurred during the homicide act. The moment he finally lost his cool was after a long evening of drinking and snorting cocaine. He drove the 3 children, Sophia, who was 4 years old, Carmina, who was 2 years old, and Teresa, who was 1 year old, to the county dump in the middle of the night. A knife was brought by him. He proceeded to slice the throats of his daughters one by one, and then rolled them into the rubbish. These were the first heinous deeds that occurred during a night that was bleak. A few hours later, he went for his mother-in-law, Marion Louise Richards, who was 47 years old, Angela, who was 24 years old, and Tracy Tuvey, who was 35 years old, and a co-worker whom he harbored a grudge against. Ruth and Maria Richards, Angela's 2 younger sisters, both of whom were only 12 and 8 years old respectively, did not make it through the devastation. Following that, as Salcido emerged from the drug-induced cloud of his rage, he entertained thoughts of ending his own life. There was a phone contact with his mother that helped him change his mind. Instead, he made his escape to Mexico, where he was born. His destiny was that he did not remain on the run for very long. After a few days, the authorities in Mexico took Salcido into custody and made arrangements for his extradition to the United States. While he was in detention, he never denied the killings. On the contrary, he acknowledged to them, blaming his wife's infidelity as well as the drugs and alcohol for inducing a psychotic depression. He disclosed all of his knowledge to the investigators. On the other hand, there was a particular aspect of the truth that he was unable to reveal since he was unaware of it himself. Carmina, his daughter, was still alive at the time. Despite the fact that her throat had been slit, Salcido's middle daughter had miraculously survived. Before a homeless guy found her, she had been lying in a state of severe injury for 36 hours, sandwiched between the bodies of her sisters. "My daddy cut me," was the only thing she could mutter. The medical staff at Petaluma Valley Hospital were perplexed by her ability to survive. According to one of the individuals, she should not have survived the injuries that she had. Due to the fact that Carmina was terrified for her life, she had kept her head tucked down, which coincidentally covered the incision on her neck and reduced the quantity of blood that she lost. The amount was just right. After being found guilty of all 7 crimes, Salcido was given the sentence of being executed in the gas chamber at San Quentin. At the time of this writing, he has been awaiting execution for a total of 29 years. Carmina, on the other hand, had a difficult path that lay ahead of her. Recovery was a laborious process, and the test was a terrifying one. The foster care system was abusive, the individual experienced psychological trauma, and they spent years moving between different care facilities. She persisted in spite of this. Carmina worked to restore a sense of trust and identity, authored a book about her experience, and found the bravery to confront her father when he was incarcerated. She attributes her success to her faith, which she credits with taking her by the hand. From that point forward, her life has not been simple, and it is possible that it may never be. However, she continues to fight, doing the best that she can. She expressed her feelings by saying, "I do not have my family, but there is nothing I can do to change that. I know that one day I will be with them, so I have to live my life." Stories such as Ramon's, as well as the others that are presented here, have the ability to cause us to contemplate the depravity of the human race. Stories such as Carmina's should serve as a reminder that human hope and perseverance can endure, even in the face of adversity. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey into the minds of those who crossed the line between love and murder. These stories remind us that evil can sometimes lurk where we least expect it, even within the walls of our own homes. If you found this video hauntingly captivating, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Creepshow for more tales of terror and true crime. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones we think we know.